we get set up, brother, I have a quick question to ask you. How many of you like to cook? You like to cook. You feel like you're chefs in the kitchen, perhaps, yes? Well, I have to tell you something. I feel like Julia Child's up here because brotherly love, we're saying it after we're talking about charity, or disinterested love, as brother just gave. And as the crowning grace, I feel like we've taken one of the ingredients and we've put it out of order. Have you ever done that? Where you've cooked something and you've made something and you think you have everything in the right amount, in the right order of events, putting them together, but it just doesn't work. So I want to try to backtrack a little bit on our recipe here, if you don't mind, and to take a look at brotherly love, or brotherly kindness. And what I like about this is we've been talking about in terms of love, and Brother Planky mentioned this. What's in there? What's always part of love? It's goodwill. Goodwill appears in every expression of love, no matter what. It's the heart of love. It's at the heart of love. But when you look at brotherly love, it fits under what category? When Brother Jack gave his portion, it's under justice. It sits under that. And so we have to think too, Brother Ralph, when you talked about justice, you talked about it too, but you also mentioned that the kind of justice that it is, it's not necessarily something that's cold or mechanical, that there's a warmth to it there. So here sits under justice, we have this brotherly love. But it's a certain type of justice that we're talking about. And while piety was towards Jehovah and Jesus, brotherly love obviously is towards our brothers or our neighbors. It's the goodwill, so we have that essence there, by right that we owe to others. It's the goodwill that right demands that should be given. It has to be because it's under justice. If we withhold it, that's sin. So it's our duty to give it up. And that is why justice is duty love. And as mentioned, piety is the expression of that goes out to God in Christ. And brotherly love is the duty love to our neighbor. The goodwill that by right we owe to our neighbor. So I as well use the scriptures for my portion, 2 Peter, and specifically 1 verse 7. Add to your piety brotherly love. And then we finally get to the charity portion of it. So while there are expressions of love in other areas, and while goodwill is always present, there are other things that may be absent with these associated graces. Now, for example, and Brother Jim kind of went into this a little bit, you may have sympathy for someone, or pity, but you may not have an appreciation. You may have appreciation, but you may not have sympathy. And you may, in terms of service and kindness, you may be doing something along those lines, but you have neither appreciation nor sympathy or pity. So you have these other areas, and we'll get into them. But in all of those things, again, goodwill is always there. It's never absent. So if we would have love to our neighbor, we must have goodwill for that neighbor. So the question you have to ask yourself then, who is your neighbor? Now we have our Canadian neighbors, and we want to certainly have goodwill towards them, and maybe the Canadians don't think that we always provide that as a nation. But we want to consider all of our neighbors. And it's not just the guy that lives next to you who doesn't mow his lawn, or the one across the street who you wonder why they park their car outside all the time, that they should put it in the garage. We look at just that specific part, but it's actually a much greater group of people. Matthew 22:39. Matthew 22:39. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So the duty love that we should have for our neighbor is the same that we should have for ourselves. And so to understand brotherly love, we have to understand who our neighbor is. And one good example of that is what? It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. You'll find that in Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. Luke 10, 25 through 37. I'm not going to read it to you. But if you remember that there was this lawyer who came to Jesus, and as a Jew, he did not believe that a Gentile or a Samaritan who were only half Jews, that they were his neighbors. Now, Jesus, of course, thought that everyone is our neighbor, so he told that story of the Good Samaritan in order to present a better understanding of who that neighbor would be. And so after Jesus told of how a priest and a Levite left their brother Jew unhelped, and how the Samaritan had, and that's in verse 33 of Luke 10, how he gave him relief, he'd asked this lawyer the question, who was the neighbor unto him who fell among thieves? So it's here in verse 37 that he forced the lawyer to admit that the Samaritan, a non-Jew, was a neighbor to the Jew. So it was a good example for him. So really in harmony with that, we have to ask ourselves, who is our neighbor? It's every human being. Every son and daughter of Adam is our neighbor. And it can be grouped into three categories. The brethren could be our one class of neighbors. The world of mankind, another. And as Brother Jim pointed out, in terms of dealing in charity, and how difficult it can be, the third is our enemies. We do owe them that brotherly love. So how do we do this? As loving one's neighbor as oneself. It requires that. Brotherly love requires that one love the neighbor as oneself. So what does it mean? To what degree are we talking here? We can answer this question in a negative way first, before we go positive. First, in a negative way, it does not mean that we should love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Do we love ourselves that way? Anyone want to nod their heads? No? Yes? We certainly do not. What would that be making of ourselves? We'd be making a god of ourselves by having that type of love for ourselves. So we wouldn't want to do that for a neighbor. It does not mean a goodwill to the neighbor with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Does this happen with some people? Certainly. Some people do put too much into that. This can happen with husband and wives. Maybe it sounds romantic that it would be heart, soul, mind, and strength for our spouses. But there is a limit to that. Is it for parents and children? No. What about friends? Certainly not. As we move away from those different relationships, it would be obvious that it would be less and less. So it's certainly wrong to think that way. That's a negative way of thinking of it. That degree of love is not meant for fellow creatures.
Oi.
Number 2. In disinterested love, we love others more than ourselves, doing what? That sacrificing that Brother Jim mentioned. Even unto laying down our lives for them. But brotherly love does not include that. We are never required to love them more than ourselves. Again, it fits under justice. It's duty love. And it's not our duty to die for others. Again, we're putting together these ingredients in the proper order, and you'll see how this works out well, fitting into Brother Jim's portion. And what we understand of that, it means that we don't love for the brethren exclusively. It means to love our neighbors, who are the brethren, the world, and our enemies. But both duty love and disinterested love are to be given to all three of these classes. Third, it doesn't mean that we should love our neighbors less than ourselves. So maybe the extreme is to go the other way. We have too much. Now, I'm betting that most of you would say that this is what the majority of people do. In our fallen condition, do we love our neighbors less than ourselves? I would say admit that most of us do that. It's almost an epidemic, frankly. There is a small minority of people that love their neighbors more than themselves. And that's also wrong. So there is a proper balance in what we mean by that brotherly love. Matthew 7:12. Matthew 7, verse 12. All things whatsoever ye do, would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. What is that called? That's called the Golden Rule. Sister Eva was telling me yesterday that was it Brother Michael had a specific golden rule. Can you give me that golden rule again? Do unto others before they do unto you. Now, if you look online, you're going to find a boatload of these false golden rules, and they're hilarious. It's almost as if you're going to a Chinese restaurant and getting those little fortunes on there. So that's certainly not the proper golden rule, although I'm sure we've all done it. What is meant by this, of course, is that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, of Matthew 22:39. That's the manward application of the golden rule. And it kind of explains the degree of love that's implied in loving one's neighbor as oneself. People are confused by that meaning of the golden rule. Now, some people apply it to your neighbor, to them, they think that anything our neighbor wants us to do for them, we are to do. So sometimes they're asking us to do something that they think would be right. And they suggest it because they think that we would want that as well. So they're confusing their needs and putting them on us and asking for that. There's another negative way of thinking it too, ourselves. Now, we may have a certain view of things, and that we think that they should do a certain thing because we would want it done to us, to ourselves. We may be misinformed on these things. We're fallen. We make mistakes. So maybe our perception of things, of the things that we want and that they should give to us, is incorrect. And so our hearts and minds may be thinking incorrectly, and in that sinful, fallen nature, that will happen. So the golden rule doesn't mean that either. Whether what they think is or what we think is does not work. So there are many things, and many people do these sinful things that they believe are done in their best interest. So we have to find out, where do we get the proper understanding, the proper meaning of the golden rule? What's the key to that particular thing? And we realize this when we look at what was given to the disciples from Jesus. His disciples who had already dedicated or given themselves to God. They weren't spirit begotten yet, but they had left all things to follow Jesus. So here's the key. They had given up their wills and taken the Lord's will as their own, and they wanted just what God wanted them to have. If we don't think about doing the Lord's will, then we're not properly understanding the base or the understanding of the golden rule. Because if we think it's what we want or what our neighbor wants, we can't do brotherly love properly. Matthew 7:12 again, all things whatsoever ye would. So our wills laid down in God's will. We want to do what the Lord wants us to do. All things. So those desires, those things that we want to do in thought, motive, word, and deed, if you were in their place, that you would want them to do for you. That is proper. It is the proper interpretation of the golden rule. First, it requires us to have our desires, what? Subject to God's will. To His will of what? What's the higher part of that again? It's justice. To His will of justice. Once we have that in mind, then we put ourselves into our neighbor's place, and we ask ourselves the question, if I were in his place, with my will and desires regarding the matter at hand, subject to God's will, what would I want my neighbor to do to me in thought, motive, word, or act? And then we build upon that. As soon as we have that answer, what that comes to mind under what we've studied and what we realize, that we would wish done to us by our neighbor in thought, motive, word, and act, that we should do then to our neighbor. So we're being proactive, we're doing those things. And I like how Brother Jolly mentions this. He calls those three things, again, being subject to God's will, and then looking as if we were in our neighbor's place, and then as soon as we figure that out, then doing that for our neighbor, he calls that a workable rule. And I like that definition a lot. A workable rule. In our fallen condition, think of how many things are not workable, and how difficult it is to know exactly what the Lord's will is, or even how to deal with our neighbor. This is something that you have to work on all the time. And you simply try each day to consider those things. It doesn't subject us to the whims and desires of the world or the flesh, but it really puts us in line in terms of what the Christian walk offers us, into God's will. We would desire only what God wants us to have. And so in each case, we would ask ourselves that, with that understanding, our subjection to God's will, what we would want our neighbor, if our places were exchanged, to do to us in thought, motive, word, and act. So then, how do we define that? Hello there. What is God's will with reference to what we should do to our neighbor? Or to put it in another form, you could ask it this way. You could say, what is God's will with reference to what we should want done to us? Again, there's a little bit of selfishness in there. We'll explain that. So what we should want done to us if we were in our neighbor's place. Here's the definition. I had to read this 4 or 5 times. Again, you have to remember, Brother Johnson, it's this wonderful math equation and everything that he wrote. So as much as there's so much heartfelt information in here, you almost have to dissect it a bit to have a better understanding. And here's the answer. He says, we would have the right to desire our neighbor to do to us in thought, motive, word, and act, which we've discussed, whatever we would concede or give up or conserve, which we keep to ourselves, to us the exercise of our inalienable rights, compatibly with the rights of others. So, do we have certain inalienable rights? We certainly do. These are things that are not subject to alienation. They cannot be bought or sold. Again, I had to read this 4 or 5 times. The first time I went, huh? Please explain that to me. I don't understand this. What does it really mean? By inalienable rights, we do not have any that are before God. In our conditions, certainly not. Through the sin of Adam, and all of our rights have been forfeited to divine justice. But we do have inalienable rights before all others. Because God has given to all certain rights in their relations to one another. That's, of course, unless we forfeit them to crime and the government and those types of things where we have exceeded the rules of the land. So those rights that we have in relationship to one another, we may, in harmony with God's will, wish our neighbors to give to us, as long as they're compatible with the rights of others. Well, what are those things? Let's try to list some. The right freely, as we please, to exercise our physical, mental, artistic, moral, and religious powers. Again, study Christ-likeness. You'll get a better understanding of each of these. But all of these things are something that we have those rights in order to exercise. And they correspond largely to the sentiments of the heart and mind and what they control, all parts of those. So what do we have for inalienable rights? Well, 1, to love and understand and to rely on God. How many people in this fallen world even have that right? How few have that real opportunity in this condition? But they belong to us. This belongs to us. To love and hope for a future good. How can you have any hope in certain conditions in this world? But you want to have that. It's part of us. We want to have that hope for a future good. The love to be firm, the love to persevere, the love to do right Godward, as Brother Jack discussed, and that love to do right manward. And the love to appreciate the good principles as to God and man. So these are the religious capacities that we have and things that we would like to exercise as far as our fellows are concerned. We also have the right to love a proper opinion of ourselves. In your work environment, how many times do you feel like maybe you've been thought of in the incorrect way? Or perhaps with family. There are different situations where the opinion of you is perhaps it's being poorly thought of. Are they providing brotherly love to you in that thought? We want to have that, and to love our others' good opinion. We also want to love our safety, rest, self-defense, all of these things. Again, you see that list. Brother Alan, he had on the screen a whole bunch of these things in terms of disappointments, but we also have all of these things that we have a right to. And all of us have those rights. We want to have that good opinion of others. So we see that the Golden Rule is a good principle. It's based on the rights of everyone, and it preserves and grants everyone's rights. And when violated, what happens? Injustice is done. Again, justice is the foundation of this. Now that we see kind of what's part of this, do we find that brotherly love is reasonable? Is it reasonable that we should love our neighbors as ourselves? Again, some people think in theory, and most people in practice deny its reasonableness. We see that it is very difficult to do. And there are only a few with their wills subject to God's will do what is right for their neighbors and expect that from their neighbors. And they expect them, again, in thought, motive, word, and act. And those who don't think it's reasonable show their fallen condition in their heart and mind. So why is brotherly love reasonable? I'm going to give you 4 points for this. Brotherly love is reasonable because it's the only quality that can secure justice to all concerned. How can you have justice with your fellow man if you do not apply the Golden Rule and have brotherly love? All persons have those inalienable rights in common. So these rights are constantly in association with one another, and their association with one another, these rights exercise themselves in your work environment, your daily conversation, your time with family, with your spouse, with kids, with the brethren, with the world, with the enemy. You're always dealing with these issues. So these rights are constantly at battle with each other, yours and theirs. So if each person is to have his rights, this is point 4, you have to concede some things. You can't always have what you think you want. And you have to conserve or keep those things that you're required to have. And you have to think of it in terms of them as well. So the Golden Rule is not an arbitrary law at all. It springs from, and it's kind of adapted to the needs of us. And what are we? We're free moral agents, are we not? So we have that, and that was mentioned at, I think, the beginning of this gathering as well. We're free moral agents. And with that kind of activity going on between each other, it underlies those relationships. It regulates them. And we need to have that. It's the only quality that will give everyone who exercises their rights, and it demonstrates this reasonableness. You can't have it unless you're doing it. The statement from Matthew 22:37, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength," is the Golden Rule Godward. And Brother Jack covered that. And all I have to do is go 2 verses later, that second commandment that's there, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." That's the Golden Rule man-word. And that's the best wisdom that we have for regulating our social conduct. We need to have that. And we see that it's a very biblical rule. Do you think man could come up with something like that? With people, you want to have your own things, and there is a selfishness that's there. And it's a sinful selfishness that would probably predominate in terms of our activity if we did not have this better understanding of wanting to do the Lord's will. So let's take a look at the elements then of brotherly love. Brother Jim mentioned these, and these elements are very similar to charity. Remember, he was building that house, and inside he had, on that first floor, he had appreciation. On the second floor, he had sympathy or pity. And then on the third, he mentioned, it's like a service, he said sacrifice. In brotherly love, we talk about it, it's more of a generic term or a general term of service. So we have appreciation, sympathy or pity, as the case is required, and then service. So those 3 match what are in charity. But there is a bit of difference between the 2, as we already know from his discourse. For appreciation and sympathy, it's the motive. What is my motive for doing it? And we'll talk a little bit about that. The quality of it. Do you think duty love or disinterested love, in terms of their qualities, are equal? You have things that you must do, and disinterested love is a certain quality that is different than duty love. And quantity as well, because quantity and duty love, we have a certain amount that we expect from them and vice versa, while disinterested love is greater. And in service, the difference between the two, between brotherly love and charity, or love, is the same three parts initially: motive, quality, quantity, and the effect. What is the effect of brotherly love versus the effect of charity, of love towards others? So let's quickly go through appreciation of brotherly love. For brotherly love, we appreciate someone for the good that they are or will become. And why? Because we want that person to appreciate us for the same reason. It's a bit selfish, isn't it? Is that a sinful selfishness? No, it's not. That's a natural selfishness, and that's perfectly fine. For charity, on the other hand, we appreciate a person not for that, but out of the delight in good principles. How many times did Brother Jim say, for the delight in good principles? How that disinterested love is so much greater. So we appreciate their character because of the good that the person is and will become. That's charity. What a wonderful ingredient. So again, it's not a sinful selfishness, but it's the very statement of the Golden Rule that proves that it permits natural selfishness. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Quickly, let's look at sympathy and pity of brotherly love and charity. We sympathize with the brethren for their lacks, faults, because we hope they do that with us. You know your faults most of the time, hopefully, and maybe you have someone to help you point them out too from the brethren. But we hope that other people, that we sympathize with the brothers for those lacks too, because we want that for ourselves. And we pity the world and our enemies for their lacks, faults, weaknesses, because we would have them pity us for the same thing. Again, a natural selfishness, not sinful. This is not so with disinterested love. For disinterested love, for charity, it is out of the delight in good principles that we sympathize with the brethren in respect to their lacks, faults, and weaknesses. And why do we do that? Because the reason we suggest that is because it puts them out of harmony with good principles. It puts them out of harmony with good principles. It's very unselfish, is it not? That understanding and charity. Same with pity. As Brother mentioned, they pity our enemies in the world because of their lacks and faults and weaknesses, put them out of harmony with good principles, and subject them to the disapproval of God, Christ, and those in harmony with them. And how difficult that is to do for charity in terms of our enemies. What about service, that third thing? And it's not a sacrificial service. There is much difference between the service of brotherly love and the service of charity. In brotherly love, it's out of love for our neighbors as ourselves. In appreciation and sympathy or pity, we take pleasure in serving them because we would have them do that for us too. We want them to serve us the same way. That is not a love that will prompt us to lay our lives down for them. It's not there. It's a natural but not a selfish sinfulness. It's a natural selfishness, not a sinful selfishness that appears here again. It's as we would want done to us. So we would do that to them. Charity, of course, we know, shows itself in service. It's, again, out of the delight in good principles, from love for the good will that they are and will become. In appreciation and sympathy or pity, we delight to what? Lay down life in sacrifice in the interest of those good principles for the blessing of the brethren, the world, and our enemies. It's a massive difference between the two, but they have the same elements. In duty love, we would never lay our life down for others. In charity or disinterested love, we would. So in one case, it is a service that is not sacrificial, and in the other, it is very much so a sacrificial service. So both of these two forms of love, this justice, one, of duty love that we have, of brotherly love, and charity, have these three elements in them. Again, appreciation, sympathy or pity, and in the case may require, as the case may require, and of course, service. What is the function of brotherly love? I think we all have it in minds now. It is to enable us to give to our neighbor what is due to them. Whether it's husband or wife, parents to children, children to parents, friend to friend, employer to employee, employee to employer, every relationship that we have, the Golden Rule has that function, to enable us to render every person their inalienable rights. You can't take that away. I've worked at Zeiss for 20 years, Carl Zeiss for 20 years, and people, when they say that, they go, my, how is it possible you've worked for the same company for 20 years? It's such a rare thing now. And the other one is, I worked for the same boss for almost 16 years. That's unheard of too. But he does offer that kind of brotherly love, that proper justice, or I wouldn't work for him. And I joke at work now that I say, I'm waiting for the next new employee to come in who would have been born the day I started working for him. That's coming up quick. And that would be someone who graduated from college, too. So you have to think about it in terms of this function for the different people and the different neighbors that we have. So what are those varying degrees? Because we have different kinds of neighbors. Again, not just the guy who doesn't quite mow his lawn correctly next to you in your house, or the guy who doesn't park the cars in the garage. We have the nearest neighbors as husband and wife, then parents and children, brothers and sisters, grandparents, grandchildren, etc. You know the list. Then it works its way down to friends and acquaintances, and there are differences in those. Then strangers, people in our own country, strangers in other countries. I apologize to our Canadian brethren, but they're brethren, so they fit under a different category as well. The Golden Rule does not require that we love everybody alike. In fact, it shows the opposite. The nearer the neighbor is, the more goodwill we are obligated to give and show to that person. And it's for that reason that a husband and wife should love one another more and treat one another better than they should love or treat any other person. Same goes for parents and children, to a lesser degree, but it's higher than others. So we vary our brotherly love according to the varying degrees of nearness to our other neighbors. And God has told us that we need to provide for our own first, hasn't He? 1 Timothy 5:8. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, etc., etc. We must fulfill our obligations first. We have to care for our own. Brotherly love requires that we put ourselves in our neighbor's place and ask, what should we, our wills again being subject to God's will, desire of Him for ourselves under the circumstances? So we see that it doesn't require us to treat everyone alike. It forbids us to do this, in fact, because our will, subject to God's will, would not authorize or sanction that course. So we see in the end again that the Golden Rule is variable in its application. And we need to consider that. So what are the advantages of brotherly love? There are 4 that I'll give you. And I'm going to start again with a negative one like I did earlier in the discussion of brotherly love. The first one is that the violation of brotherly love would make our relationships miserable. How many times has that happened to you in this life, in this fallen condition? Again, whether spouse, parents, children, etc., co-workers, your boss, them versus you, employee versus employer. So it shows that there's an advantage to having brotherly love, isn't isn't it? Do you want to live your life in a miserable way without it with your fellow man? Certainly not. And another advantage to it, the second one, is the practice of the golden rule keeps many from the evils in relationship with another person. So by practicing it, it prevents you from doing things that are incorrect. It helps you in that way. I listen to Dennis Prager a lot, and he uses this for happiness. And he says that you should always be happy. It's your moral obligation to be happy. Even if you don't feel it inside you, it is your responsibility to show that to other people. It's your obligation. Otherwise, you take everybody down. I think that's the same here with brotherly love. We want to practice that golden rule because it helps us out, and not only does it for us, it helps them out. So we want that. Third advantage, it helps people towards consecration. This is where we start to aim our direction towards charity. One is led to the place where the transition from duty love to disinterested love takes place. What a wonderful thing. We take piety, we take brotherly love, and we merge them into disinterested love. So we have it towards Jehovah, Godward, we have it manward in brotherly love, and that cooperation helps us in consecration, in our consecrating faith. Helps them to prompt people into consecration. So think of how those ingredients are necessary in order to add that last one. Here's the last advantage I'll give you for brotherly love. And this is mentioned, Brother Jolly mentions this by saying, the restored human race in the kingdom will make people happy with one another. Everyone loving his neighbor as himself, everyone conceding or conserving his neighbor's rights, our own, theirs, just as he would have his own rights done, will make them happy forever in their relations with one another. And with the ability to do that as we walk towards perfection, what a wonderful thing that will be. How do we cultivate it? There are two ways, and again, you have to look at the Christ-likeness articles to understand this. There's a special method and a general method, and if you know that there are special methods and general methods for many things, and so you have to look at those lists. And I'm only going to list the two that apply specifically to cultivating brotherly love. One, the special one, is subjecting our hearts and minds to the influence of God's Word by holding its pertinent parts upon us. So we need to study the Bible. How else are you going to know the Lord's will unless you study the Bible? Then there's the general way of doing it, and that's exercising or exercise in developing good. So again, you're always trying to do that. So those two things, studying the Word and exercising and developing good, will help you in exercising the golden rule. We should always put ourselves into the other person's place and ask ourselves, what would I, with my will in the matter subject to God's will, want them to do to me in thought, motive, word, and act if they were in my place and I am theirs? That's how we can do it. That's the only way we can do it. We should hold these thoughts on our mind and heart and subject ourselves to that influence. So in every relation, we can see these principles will apply. And the golden rule, if practiced, will be helpful to God's people and to the entire world of mankind, will it not? There are certainly trials of brotherly love, and you can see it in, again, our fallen condition, losses, delays, restraints. Again, you've seen that list of all the negative things that can happen in this life. And all of these things are trials upon that proper development of brotherly love. But no matter how much the cost, we should try to do the right thing to our neighbor. Brotherly love is a very good quality. And when you take that and you add that together with the other ones, and you get to that crowning quality of charity, of disinterested love, what a wonderful thing that we see. And what I'd like to close with, just again, a quick reminder of what we've had in this addition problem. We've had faith, fortitude or hope, and knowledge. These are the ingredients of what? Wisdom. Self-control and patience, the ingredients of power. Piety and brotherly love, the ingredients of justice. And then the one that Brother just gave on charity is the one for love. What a wonderful example we have in our Heavenly Father in terms of developing our characters. And that we can use these things for the betterment of our consecrated walk. And may the Lord add His blessing.